Hello, everyone, and thank you. Yes, why is everyone so far back? I promise I won't bite, but I'm really excited to be here today. Hello, everyone. My name is Parker McMullen Bushman, and I'm excited for our session today. So this is not going to be the traditional field safety session. We actually have it set up into two different sessions. We're going to be talking about field safety, but emotional and mental safety, especially for people who are queer, people who are femme, working in outdoor environments. We're going to have a session that is here with all of us, and then we're also going to have a roundtable session right after if folks would like to dig a little bit deeper into these topics and talk about how do we implement this in our day-to-day work in the field. So our session one is ensuring safety and inclusion in field work, and session two is our roundtable discussions. So my name is Parker McMullen Bushman. My pronouns are they, she, and I'm excited to be here today. A little bit about myself. I like to say that I wear a number of different head wraps instead of hats. I am the CEO of Ecoinclusive Strategies. I work primarily with conservation-based orgs around their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. I'm also the founder of Summit for Action. This year, Summit for Action happened 2 weeks ago, and this year our summit tackled issues around not only community engagement, but how grassroots efforts can make global change around environmental justice. I'm also the co-founder of Inclusive Guide. In addition to this, I sit on a number of local and national boards, and you can find me on social media under the handle QueenWork. Queen stands for Keep Widening Environmental Engagement Narratives, and I use my platform to provide representation for folks who usually aren't represented in the outdoor fields. I have had a long and storied career in outdoor education, natural resources, and environmental education, working at a variety of sites all over the United States. And throughout my career, people often ask me, how did you get here? And they weren't like wondering, did I fly in that day or drive? They were wondering, how did I, as a person of color, make it into a field where there's not a whole lot of people that look like me? And it wasn't a silly question, because I often worked on teams like this, where I was the only person of color. And I started to wonder, why that was too. I had a very different background from the people that I worked with and got into the field in a different way. And I decided that I wanted to go back and to school and kind of study and research, environmental engagement in different communities, what community engagement looks like when it's really inclusive, and what inclusive science communication looks like. So I went back, I got my Master's of Science in Natural Resources, and did a project about watershed in the eastern shore of Virginia and engagement and education around that work. Some things that I found along the way when we talk about access and enjoyment of the outdoors and how we make that equitable is that representation is important, and that we can't ignore the roles that our identities take when we are out in the field. So we can't ignore how inclusion, equity, history, and social justice work ties into environmental work and natural resource work. And so when we talk about safety and safety in the field, right, we're going to, typically when people talk about safety, right, we're thinking of things like how are we physically safe in the field. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But we're also going to be talking about different aspects of safety. We know that physical safety is important when doing field work, and the concept of safety in the field often prioritize that physical safety, such as ensuring that we have the proper equipment and managing risk in outdoor environments. However, mental and emotional safety is also very important, especially when we talk about making these spaces inclusive and open to people who maybe we don't see traditionally represented. Safety is a very multi-dimensional issue, especially for those with marginalized identities. And so when we talk about our different identities, right, first we have to understand that diversity is representation of lots of different people within a space. And when I talk with organizations, oftentimes they are thinking about, who is not represented in that space. And that's really important. We have lots of different ways to represent diversity. It's not only racial, right? We also have sexual orientation, gender, our age ranges within a space, our abilities and disabilities. A lot of times we are focusing on race, especially here in the United States, because our racial demographics in the US are changing so quickly. So last year we hit the point where people in the 18 and younger demographic, more than half of them were people of color. And we've seen this progression over the years. If you were to look at our country's demographics back in the 1990s, we see that our non-Hispanic white demographic was about 76% of our population. You flash forward to 2019, you see that that's now 60-ish% of the population. And it's estimated that in the next 15 to 20 years, we're going to see an even bigger shift. And our Hispanic demographic is our fastest growing demographic here in the United States. Our non-Hispanic white demographic is going to be down to 46%. Even though we are seeing a lot of changes in diversity in the United States, things like our disabled community makes up 25% of the population. People who were assigned female at birth make up 51% of our population, right? Even though we have a lot of diversity, we are not seeing as much changes within, especially our conservation-based orgs. And so the Green 2.0 report came out a few years back, and it really talked about that representation within conservation-based organizations. And what they found is that people of color were not breaking, but despite making up about 40% of our population, we're not breaking the 12 to 16% green ceiling within organizations. And they see within those organizations that are working, people are doing the work and they're really trying to be more diverse in a lot of spaces. What they see is that we get a lot of diversity in entry-level positions, but not as much as we make our way up the ladder. And when we look at, different areas of diversity, right, we see that within the STEM fields, you can see our male and female demographics, right, are not at the level that they should be, for the representation that we have in our country. We see the same. Not as much representation in people of color or in folks with disabilities. And that also goes over into who is in these spaces, right? And so when we look at even visitation to our national parks and racial demographics, we see that it is not as equal, right? We know on the left, we have our US population. On the right three columns, we have our visitors to national forests, national wildlife refuge, and national parks. So oftentimes when I talk to organizations that are like, oh, we want to have diversity, we want to create safe and welcoming spaces for everyone that comes and is either working within our organization, doing field work, people who are in the day-to-day, they're wondering, one, why do we have those disparities within our numbers and what we can do about it, right? And some of it is about how do people feel within these spaces, right? Do people feel like they are safe? Do they feel like they are welcome? Do they feel like this is a place that they can do their work in safety? And so we can't only think about diversity, right? When we think about this, we want the diversity, but the diversity is a result of how inclusive we're being, if we're creating a place of belonging, and if we are thinking about equity measures that are needed to happen to make sure that everyone is able to participate at the same levels. And so when we talk about equity first, right, equity is different than equality. Equality says that we treat everyone the same in every situation, which is kind of how we've been doing things, right? When we think about field work, we think mainly about the work that has to be done, and maybe not so much about the different ways that people might come to this work. Equity says, what do we need to provide people to be able to fully participate in all of the different ways, right? And how do we provide that in a way that people feel like they are getting what they need to fully be in the space? Equality says we give everyone the same thing. Equity says, okay, we know that people show up different, so how do we need to provide different things? And that can be, providing something for someone who has a disability. It can be understanding that if someone who is AFAB and is out in the field for a very long time, we're gonna have to start thinking about things like menstrual cycles, and how are we providing a safe space and a place that people feel comfortable dealing with those needs, right? So we have to do things differently to provide those spaces that really work for everyone. The next step is inclusion, right? And how do we make sure that people feel really welcomed and included within a space? And inclusion means that we're giving people a voice within spaces. Diversity is that representation. Having lots of different people at the table is diversity. Inclusion says we are giving those different people a voice, and they're involved in the process. So we're providing a space where people are able to talk about what are the needs that they have within these different environments, and figure out together how we provide for those things. And then belonging is the result of inclusion that has been done really well. When people feel like they belong, it is that emotional and psychological aspect of inclusion. Belonging represents the feeling that individuals have when they feel like they are a part of a group, that they are respected, and when they feel like they belong, they're more likely to be really invested within in an organization and the work that is happening. So before we get down into some nitty-gritty examples and talking through some things that we can consider, I also want to talk about another important dynamic when we go through life, and that is how our identities, right, how our identities are shown within a space, and the power dynamics and access to resources that occurs when we have certain identities, right? And so this is our wheel of power and privilege. It is such a, like a dun 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 name for it. I know that privilege kind of has like a rap that is a really it's a word that can be a flashpoint, right? But when I describe privilege, it's not that you have had everything handed to you, you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth. But privilege really is having places that have been built with you in mind, right? So I'm an able-bodied person on most days when my arthritis in my knees isn't bothering me. And that means that if I want to go shopping one day, right, I am able to just go and be assured that I can get into most spaces, right? If I were a wheelchair user, I might have a harder time. I might show up at, my cute little boutique fashion shop that I heard about and realize that it's actually on the second floor and it's in a building that doesn't have an elevator, right? So as an able-bodied person, I have privilege because I moved through a world that was built with able-bodied people in mind. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm like rich and wealthy beyond my wildest dreams and have nothing to worry about, but it just means in that portion of my identity, I have more privilege and a little bit of power over people who are disabled. And power just means that I have more access to resources, safety and protection, support systems, right? Because I'm operating in a world that was built for able-bodied people. When we're talking about power and privilege in the areas that we operate in, we should think about the ways that our different identities might make it easier for us to operate in certain spaces. So if we are an English speaker, then we are probably pretty sure that most of the information that we're going to get, we're going to be able to understand pretty easily, pretty quickly, that people listening to us, if we're out in the field and we're doing something and someone randomly comes up and we have to speak to them, that the first thing they're not going to do because they see that we are a native English speaker is not be like, oh, well, where are you from, or I can't understand you, or start to think about our identity that as we show up in this space, right? So the people or identities that are in the center have just a little bit more access to these resources, everything from having your voice understood, flexibility, recognition when we talk about how protocols and things are built, right? Have a little bit more of that representation than people who are a little bit further out in our circle and people who are on the very edges. So when we think about field safety, right, and we should think about who has been prioritized previously, what voices have been heard when people were, first coming up with like protocols for being out in the field and being safe in the field. What were those protocols based on, right? What types of identities were included in that? So, when we are talking about identity and creating safe and inclusive spaces in the field, we have to think about a few different things. So we have to think about, even though the field work is an essential component, right? What are ways that we can think about how other people come into the spaces? We know that physical safety is really important, but we have to expand outside of that when we think about risk, right, within the field, to thinking about different identity types. And your risk when you're in a field space can be amplified or changed, based on how your identities intersect with one another, right? So someone who is Black and is a Black male might have a different set of concerns while doing field safety than someone who is Black and a Black female or a Black non-binary person, right? Those, while there still might be racial concerns, there also may be concerns based around gender. And it's really important to understand how those different identities might overlap. So, we have to think about discrimination within field research and field spaces. I've been working in natural resources and the environment for many years, and this is a topic that I've talked a lot about. And sometimes people will be like, well, what do you mean? Like, you're out in nature. Like, are you trying to say the trees are racist? Like, what does it mean that we have to think about discrimination? But oftentimes when we're in field spaces, it's not just us. Like, if I was just out by myself, that would be different. But oftentimes we're in spaces where other humans are, right? And so there's all sorts of other things that might come up. You might be worried about verbal harassment or abuse. You might be worried about being excluded from being able to access certain spaces because of someone's how someone thinks about your identity. You might be worried about your credibility and how that shows up in spaces. For me, as a young person doing field work, right? I was a young environmentalist. I often found myself in field situations where I was fearful or felt othered or unsure of my safety working within spaces. I received racial jokes and inappropriate comments. Colleagues often made joking remarks about my race. Perhaps, they weren't trying to be malicious, but it still contributed to a difficult work environment, right? I actually had someone, say something to me like, oh, I bet you don't want to be out in the field all day, right? Based on your history, right? So implying like a history of slavery and then Black people working out in the field again. There were assumptions about my competence and background. I was often questioned about whether I belonged in a field space, right? I was also assumed to be less knowledgeable or skilled compared to my white colleagues. There would also be comments like, I wouldn't have expected you to be doing this type of work. I faced hostility from landowners who were not keen on a Black person working on the land around them. And I faced suspicion in areas about why I was on certain land doing certain work. Colleagues made inappropriate jokes about my weight, right? And they would say things like, oh, I guess, because, I've always been blessed. And they would say things like, oh, well, at least field work is a good way to lose some pounds, right? Out here working. Another part of it that was emotional safety out in the field is I was often excluded from social events and activities by my colleagues. And I don't think that they were doing it intentionally, but intentionally. But thinking about being one of your only identity in a space, right? Whether that is a person of color or whether that is a woman or a non-binary person, right? Oftentimes, like people, they were very welcoming or nice during the day outside of the microaggressions. But when they chose to like get people together, like we're gonna do an activity or we're gonna go out and do this thing, they often invited people who were similar to them, right, to go do those things and didn't make kind of that extra connection with me. And so when we are thinking about, safety for queer, femme, and BIPOC individuals within the space, we have to understand that that safety takes on an extra kind of facet, an extra dimension. So there is the physical safety, right? And physical safety for people of marginalized identities may go beyond just like, are you using the right equipment and following the right protocols so you don't get hurt in the field. It also can be vulnerability within certain spaces, especially if you are I worked in a lot of remote areas that where some of the people that lived there were hostile to people of my identity, right? And so that's an extra dimension. You also, it might be perceived physical vulnerability. If you are a femme presenting person working out in a remote area and not knowing who might come across you, right? You may feel not safe. There's also that kind of extra heightened risk for BIPOC people within the space if they're worried about who might come. I've had landowners come out with guns, right, to ask what I was doing in a specific space, right? And so there's that extra safety. And again, you know, it is about people within the space. I don't know how many of folks are on TikTok, right? But earlier this year, there was a huge debate on the social medias. And the question was asked to femme presenting people that if you were out in the woods, would you rather be out in the woods with a man or with a bear? A man that you did not know or with a bear. And overwhelmingly, the response was that women chose the bear. And people were mad, especially men were very mad. And they kept saying, you know, they questioned that. They're like, oh, well, you know, can you fight a bear? Like, what do you think you're gonna do with the bear? You're gonna get hurt or whatever, right? But it wasn't actually about the bear. It was about the fact that women are often attacked by men, right? And when we look at the statistics, we see that there is a large number. You probably know multiple women that have been attacked by men, right? They had a lot of responses that were things like, well, you know what to expect from the bear. Absolutely, a bear, I would stay with a bear because humans are capable of so much worse. Or the bear, because if I got attacked by a bear, people at least would believe me, right? And so there is this fear that people have for their physical safety because they know what can happen if you are trapped alone with people, as a male figure that you don't know. And that is something that we have to think about. Our UN data shows that 1 in 3 women across the world have experienced some either intimate partner or non-partner sexual violence, right? So that is a physical safety issue that femme people may feel in the field, though it could happen to anyone. We also have to think about mental and emotional safety. And it has to be given the same level of attention because these are the keys to an individual's overall well-being within a space and their ability to be able to contribute effectively when they are doing the work that they're supposed to be doing. Being made to feel emotionally unsafe or being subjected to identity-based harassment can be as detrimental as physical threats, if not more. And so for queer, femme, and BIPOC individuals, the emotional and psychological toll of navigating hostile or unfamiliar environments can really impact their safety and effectiveness in the field. And again, they might face things like hostility or microaggressions, right? If you are a femme person, you might face people not believing that you can do the type of work, really doubting your ability. You might not even receive it from people on your team, right? But from landowners, local communities, things like that. You might feel isolated, especially if you're on a team where you're one of a few people of your gender out and doing this work in the field. You might feel invisible or invalidated in the work that you're doing. And when we think about people who are trans or non-binary, they might experience things like misgendering or subject to invasive questions about their identity and who they are. And so we have to think about that mental and emotional safety, also that psychological safety within field environments. And we've been talking a lot about individuals, but when conducting field work, especially within this conservation realm, research and environmental science, we also have to acknowledge and address the unique challenges that arise when we are working with marginalized communities, particularly indigenous communities. One of the foundational principles for ensuring ethical and respectful engagement of communities and indigenous communities is free, prior, and informed consent, right? And FPIC is not only a legal and ethical standard, but it's also a critical tool for when we are addressing power dynamics and promoting community safety, the safety of the communities that we might be doing work in. And so when we're conducting field work, particularly in areas like conservation, research, or environmental science, we have to acknowledge that those unique vulnerabilities that are faced by marginalized communities. Those communities often have deep and ancestral connections to the land and engage in their resources that are there, as well as a history of marginalization that makes them wary of people who might be coming from the outside to do research or things on their land because they have had a big history of exploitation. And so we have to think about that, and one of the foundational principles for thinking about this is FPIC. We're going to go through it a little bit more during our next session. But we have to, it provides a way for you to think about those power imbalances that might manifest. It also allows us to kind of have a structure for thinking about things ahead of time and how we build relationships with communities ahead of time before we are doing the work, and also how we might co-create some of this work with them. So I'm watching my time because I think there's someone coming up after me. But so when we talk about creating inclusive and safe field environments, there are a few things that we can think about and try to employ. And I'm going to go through each one of these: inclusive safety protocols, reporting and support structures for different groups of people, pre-field work, cultural assessments of not only the communities that you might be working in, but your organizations, team culture building, and that free, prior, and informed consent. So for our inclusive field safety protocols, we have to really make sure that our field safety work that we're doing includes not only the physical part, but also the emotional and mental risk assessment for the work that we're going to do, and taking into account the unique needs of queer, femme, and BIPOC individuals. We need to train all of our team members on those inclusive practices and how we can create spaces of belonging, including the use of things like correct pronouns, how do we address microaggressions when they show up, and respecting diverse identities when we are out and in the field. We also should provide clear reporting and support structures for groups of people. We need to establish confidential channels for reporting harassment or discrimination. And so I've worked with this can happen within big organizations and small organizations. So, do you have a way that people can, a person that they can report to, or do you have that anonymous channel? So, I've had organizations that have provided like just a Google form that people could use to report harassment or microaggressions that happen. And then, that's not always meant to be like a punitive thing for someone who made a mistake, and said something inappropriate, but it lets people know where the training needs to happen and who they need to check in on, right? There's other resources that you can offer, like counseling and emotional support for individuals who might be experiencing mental or emotional distress while they're doing field work. Also, pre-field work cultural assessments. What is the culture of this place that you're going to be doing your work in, right? And you need to ensure that your marginalized team members are aware of the potential risks that might happen and have strategies for staying safe within a certain area. I think this is really important, but it's something that people maybe feel worried about doing or worried about addressing. I once had a position that I went into several years ago. I had an employer, after I'd been working there over a year, tell me that they almost didn't hire me because the area was they knew had a lot of racism, and they were worried about bringing in a person of color into that space. And I thought it was interesting because they did hire me, and I was very grateful that they did, but they didn't tell me about it. They didn't, prepare me or have a conversation and say, like, we really want you for this position. We do want you to understand the area that you're coming into so that you can make the most informed decision, right? But, they were like, kind of wrestled with it and then brought me in, and they're like, oh, you actually do work really well with the farmers and the watermen that are around here, right? So they were surprised because they were worried that it would be an issue. But, people of color are not, or even femme people or other people, they're not usually surprised when you tell them that there's racism and sexism and things within a space. But a lot of times what organizations tout is, we know that we are a safe and welcoming space and we've done the work, right? But they don't consider that people coming in, it's not just your organization that they're coming into a community, right? And so we may tout that this is going to be a safe and welcoming space for someone, and they get there and maybe you have done the work and you're providing a soft place to land, which is really important, but you haven't considered that they still have to go out into the community and be involved with the community. Another thing is proactive team culture building. So within your team, are you building an inclusive and supportive team culture where diverse voices are not only, not tolerated, not like, oh, that's nice, but like celebrated for that diversity that people bring into a space. When we talk about places, having privilege within a space, meaning that a space was designed with your type of identity in mind, right? When we go into those spaces, often we're used to the culture there, we're used to a certain way of thinking and of doing things because that's the way that it's been done, and we're comfortable in it because that's, either it suits our identity or that's the way that we've always done it. And then someone with different identities come in and they have things to say and they have opinions and they want to share their thought process and how they're experiencing a space. And, we'll say things like, oh, that's okay. Thank you for sharing. And when you're here long enough, you'll learn how to do it a certain way, or, thanks for your input. But we don't really value and include those voices and make the changes that we need to make based on what people are saying. So we have to build a team culture that is really focused on how do we include those voices, how do we bring those people together, and how do we take seriously the ways that different identities are showing up within the world. And then last but not least, we have the free, prior, and informed consent. And so free means that consent, when we're working with communities, especially indigenous communities, that consent is being given to do the research, do the work, or whatever it is on their land without being coerced, manipulated, or pressured from external parties. So communities must be free to make the decisions without fear of retribution for that decision. Prior means that consent has to be sought well before we're doing work within that community. So the community knows that we're coming, they understand all the things that we're going to be doing within this space, how it might affect or not affect the land. Maybe we're just observing, right? Maybe we are doing work to improve habitat or whatever. Do we have the consent of the community prior? Informed means that communities are provided with all of the information that they need to understand this work and the potential impacts that might occur, risks, benefits from the project, so on and so forth. And then, that consent means that, again, they have the right to say yes or no once they have gotten that final information. All right, so I am hoping that folks from this session will join us for the next one, because in our next session, your turn, we're going to be having discussions about how this might apply to the individual work that you're doing. The examples and things that I gave, I kind of painted with a broad brush. We want to give you the opportunity to say, okay, if I'm thinking about inclusion within my work, what does that mean? How does that show up? How might that work in these particular situations? We're also going to talk about free, prior, informed consent, and what does it take to really do good community engagement that makes that a reality. So I want to thank you all for coming and listening, and I'm going to go ahead and clear things out for our next presenter.